So I'd like to say thank you to all people, for all you for coming, as I said before. It's been quite a long break since our last one, because we had the time in between when we had to cancel, unfortunately, because the person who was coming to speak to us developed COVID, and actually was quite poorly with it. So, and it was in a short time that we knew about it, the situation. So we just couldn't find anyone to fill in at that time, especially on this particular subject. It's not something you can expect someone to do in 5 minutes, of course. So it is about 8 weeks, I suppose, since we met, but I'm glad we're all here together again. One more to you, as I said before, and I want to say thank you, as always, to all people who've helped, the people in the kitchen, the setting up and all the usual arrangements, and serving and washing up, and of course, not least Joyce for organising all this part of it for us. So we're very, very grateful. So this evening, we welcome the Rev Robert Creamer. Now, Robert is a retired Methodist minister. I didn't think we allowed him to, but we do apparently. So you're all right, Hilary, you know. Although we've not finally decided whether we're letting you go, to be honest, but that's another story. Now, Robert and his wife Pat, who is also a minister, she's Reverend Pat, so joined our congregation when they came to live in this area a couple of years, I suppose, ago now. Something like that. And we're delighted to have them, and the fact that they chose to make their home our Methodist congregation here at the Triangle. We're very pleased about that. The thing is, you see, when you've got two ministers, or no, if we get one free. That's excellent, isn't it? Yeah, but wait for the next series when I should be writing. Anyway, we do look forward to what you have to say to us, Robert. So a warm welcome and thank you. Over to you.
Okay, right, thank you very much indeed. Does that work?
Just a bit.
Just a bit. Is that?
That's fine.
Is that all right? Is that okay? Right, okay. Right, well, a few weeks ago, I was talking to our daughter, Rachel, and so I've let myself in to have to give this talk about my life in 5 objects and 2 songs. And I really don't know what to choose in terms of the songs. I mean, could you help me? What sort of ideas do you think I could choose for that? So she said, well, Dad, you'll be choosing from Gregorian chants, Mozart, S Club 7, Dido, or Steps, or generic classical. Well, I haven't chosen from any of those, actually. And when I was running through this, having a practice run with our daughter on Sunday, she said, you haven't chosen any of the things that I was going to suggest, have you? But, well, no. The first piece of music to help to tell my story is going to be the Beatles track, Help. Now, the reason that I've chosen this is to give a little extract of my childhood experiences. When I was at primary school, 1962 to 1966, and I'll save you the maths, it means I'm 67 going on 68. We lived in a little village called Amesbury, which is in the middle of Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire. And most people have never heard of Amesbury. But you will all have heard of Stonehenge. And Amesbury is the little village about 1.5 miles away from Stonehenge. So as children, you know, on bank holidays, we would pack a picnic. We could walk 1.5 miles to Stonehenge. We could play around on the stones. It was complete open access then. You know, it was just in a field. And if you had someone strong enough, they could put you up on one of these sort of fallen stones, and you can have your picnic right, sitting on the stone. I mean, now it's sort of closed access, and you have to pay an enormous fee just to sort of get close to them. But that was part of my childhood experience. But many of you may remember the Beatles film Help. You do? Whew, that's good. Well, you may remember one of the opening sequences is them chasing around on Salisbury Plain with some tanks. It was Army sort of training area. And so the Beatles, it's the mid-60s, 65 I think it was, they came to stay in Amesbury, our little village. Now, there's not too much that went on in Amesbury, but there were 2 hotels. They were, 2-star, AA 2-star hotels. And the rumour went round the village that they had actually booked both of those hotels, but to keep it secret as to which one they were going to stay in. And, well, they stayed in one and not the other. But, goodness me, how much money have they got? They can book 2 hotels completely. But there we are. They did, and eventually, after a lot of persuasion, my parents said it would be all right for me to go and stand outside of the hotels one of those evenings and see if they would come out. And at one point, one of the Beatles came out, and we're not quite sure whether it was George or whether it was Paul, but it doesn't matter. We saw a Beatle! Yeah, they were there for 2 or 3 days. They did the shoot on Salisbury Plain with the Army sort of as a backdrop. And my family weren't that sort of keen on going to the cinema, but we were allowed to go and see the film Help when we were children. So a little extract from my childhood. We'll listen to... Well, that may have taken some of you back to the days of your youth. Right, the first object is this poster here for the Edinburgh Fringe. And thank you very much to Les for the help he's given me in getting this all sorted out, so it's on the PowerPoint as well. I've put that as an object because it's something that has drawn our family together in a particular way. Pat and I met in Exeter in Devon. Pat was a probationary minister in the circuit, and I was at Exeter University training to be a social worker, and we met in the romantic context of the local preachers' meeting. When I was accepted as candidate for ministry, though, I was candidated for ministry, I was given a place at Hartley Victoria College in Manchester for my ministerial training. And I have to be very grateful to Pat, because at that point in time, just as we were getting married, she was in conversations with a wealthy suburban circuit in South London who were after her as a minister. And she very graciously put that conversation to one side and found an appointment in the Manchester district so we could actually be together when we got married. So that took us to Ashton-under-Lyne. That was the circuit we lived in Mossley. And then we moved, and our son Mark was born there, and then we moved into Whalley Range south of the centre of Manchester City. And Rachel, our daughter, was born there. We moved from Manchester to Leeds when they were 8 and 6. But all of us have got some sort of interest in drama in one way or another. And in their sort of mid-late teenage, when they were still willing to come on summer holiday with us, we agreed that we would go to the Edinburgh Fringe for a week. We would hire a student flat for a week, and we would go to as many different dramas and theatres and productions as energy and money would allow, in all sorts of different combinations of the 1, 2, 3, or in fact all 4 of us. And we enjoyed that, and that was great. But both of them have got this interest in drama. Mark went to Salford University to do media and performance, and he now works in the university department, and he's the venue manager of the New Adelphi Theatre as part of the University of Salford. And Rachel, our daughter, has trained to be an actor, and she does some freelance work of medical role play. So with trainee doctors, she's given a script of how to be a diagnosis of a patient, and she has to act it out, and the trainee doctor has to have the conversation with her as part of the examination as to whether they're picking the things up, what sort of manner that they have. So both of them have got this interest in drama. I've never been on the stage at all, so I don't know quite where it comes from, but in Yorkshire there is a saying that parsons are nowt but failed actors. So, there we are. Well, yeah, you can think of a few that might fit that category, can't you? Yeah, right. So, that's our family, the family I've come from, and the family that Pat and I created. My next object is my ordination Bible, and you can see the sort of front is up there. You can see that the presentation label has been sort of damaged a bit. It does mean that I actually use this Bible, you know, and I had sort of things inside it and the prints come off it, so I was a bit unfortunate about that, but I still have it, and it's something that's really, really important to me. I always wanted to be a minister. My father is also a minister. And there's a family story that is told of me that when my grandparents were staying, they took me out for a walk one day, and I was about 6 years old, apparently. And my grandfather said, "Now, Robert, what do you want to be when you grow up?" To which I said, "Oh, I want to be a minister, because if you're one of those, you don't have to buy a house." Well, I hope that sort of the reasons for becoming a minister have developed a little bit further and deeper than just you don't have to buy a house. But it's something that's always been in me, and part of that is an admiration for my father. My first degree was in geography, and when I was coming to the end of that, there was a whole question about, well, should I do something about this sense of calling or not? And I went to have a conversation with someone who's the principal of one of our Methodist theological colleges, and I explained my situation. And he said to me, "Well, look, first of all, you need to train to be a local preacher. And if you're a complete failure of that, that is a clear sign from God that you are not called to ministry." He said, "Well, if you weren't a minister, what would you do?" And I said, "Well, I'd sort of either be a social worker or a town planner." That's the thing. So, well, see if you can find your vocation in that. If you can settle in that, and that's fine. But if you can't settle in that, then start the process of candidating. So I went to Exeter. There was a grant that I was able to secure, and there was a place that I was offered, and I went down to Exeter and trained to be a social worker. But I was sure that I still wanted to be a minister, so I candidated while I was training as a social worker. And as I said, I was placed up in Manchester for my training. Now, my father's been a hugely important, significant and strong influence on me, but I also knew that if I was going to be, who God called me to be, I needed to be out of his ambit, as it were. So I ended up in the north, and his ministry has all been in the south of England. I needed to have that space between him and me for me to be myself and not just my father's son. So the way to do that was physically distance ourselves. Though there is one occasion when our ministries have overlapped. When I was training at Hartley, everyone had to do a practical placement in term time. And in my second and third year, I was assistant to the Methodist chaplain at Strangeways Prison, which meant on every Friday lunchtime, I used to go into the prison, and I was given the list of the men who'd come into prison that week who said that they were either Methodist or Free Church. And then I went to find them in whatever cell it was that they were in, and I explained, I was the assistant to the chaplain, and we have a Sunday service that you could come to, and there's a fellowship group on a Tuesday evening, you might like to do that. And sometimes sort of conversations would develop, and well, I'll come back and see you next week if that's what you'd like me to do. But it was one of these conversations. I went in and had my standard sort of line, well, my name is Robert Creamer. I'm the assistant to the Methodist chaplain of this prison. I understand you put yourself down as Methodist or Free Church, so I've come to see you. This man looked at me and he said, can you say your name again? And I said, yeah, my name's Robert Creamer. And he said, have you got a relative who's a minister? So I said, well, yes, my wife is a minister and my father is a minister too. Was your father ever a prison chaplain? So I said, well, yes, he was actually. He was prison chaplain on one of the prisons on the Isle of Wight. I remember him, he says. He did these really good Bible studies. Well, it's difficult to know how to take that. They might have been really good, but they weren't quite good enough to keep him on the straight and narrow. Or, as I like to think, they were so good that he never found anything of that quality in any church that he went to. So he kept on committing crime so that he might end up in prison again with that minister who did those really good Bible studies. So, it was a great dream of mine to become a minister, and on the 3rd of July 1984, which is St. Thomas's Day, so I was right there with Hilary on Sunday morning, doubting Thomas, you've got to keep asking these questions. In a sense, my dreams had come true because I wanted to be married, I wanted to have children, and I wanted to be ordained. And it all happened. That story completed 3rd of July 1984. My next object is this one here, which is a picture of the University of Manchester on the Oxford Road. Okay. Now, I did my ministerial training at Manchester, and the essence of it was to do the Bachelor of Divinity degree at Manchester University, and I really, really enjoyed that very much indeed. But just before I was ordained, rather unexpectedly, I was asked to leave the appointment that we were in and go and be the Methodist chaplain at Manchester University, which was a bit of a shock to the system, but I agreed to go. So we moved back into Manchester and lived in Whalley Range. Now, the chaplaincy in Manchester, there's a big ecumenical chaplaincy building, and it's a 4-way ecumenical project of Anglican, Methodist, Baptist URC. And our morning congregation, we had 2 chaplains, leading the service. One would lead and one would preach, and the same with the evening congregation too. And it was just a matter of rota as to who was on. So we exercised in those 1980s mutual recognition of ministry quite clearly, Though I learned a lot about team dynamics because we all came with our own individual agenda from our denominational tradition, and often, without realizing, we ended up stepping on each other's toes. So sometimes team dynamics there was quite strained and difficult, and it was challenging at those times, but had to work through it and you got on with it. The evening congregation was almost entirely student. So the average, the age range was between 18 and 22. And it was a great joy for me to be there because in my previous appointment, most of the people that I was working with were at least as old as my parents, if not my grandparents. So suddenly, there was all these 18 to 22-year-olds. And, if there are 1 or 2 postgraduates hanging around at 24, 25, they're a bit old, aren't they? Well, it's a tremendous excitement. And because students, generally do a 3-year degree, that congregation renewed itself completely every 3 years. So incredible sort of dynamic about it. And there was no, we've always done it this way tradition. It was alive in many ways. there was a student group that I worked with that used to meet on a Friday night, and we would have, different speakers every Friday evening that would bring stories and challenge and exploration of what faith was all about. So that meant it didn't start till about 8 o'clock, 8:30, and it didn't get back till 10, 11, 11:30 or whatever. Yeah, and Pat's got her own story and her own take on that because she was left at home looking after the children. But as well as that Friday night, I was also out on a Wednesday night. One of the halls of residence in Manchester University is called Hume Hall. And when Owens College became the University of Manchester, it had a secular charter. And so it was set up very much against the sort of Oxbridge tradition of the 19th century, where you had to be a member of the Church of England in order to go to the college. Manchester Secular University won't have any of this religious nonsense as part of our entry. And there was this man, I don't know what his name was, but he thought this was a bad thing. And, young men going up to university, they should have some spiritual nourishment and guidance. So he founded this hall, Hume Hall, with a chaplain and a chapel. Well, it ended up being sold over to the university, but it retained the position of a chaplain and a chapel. And in those ecumenical days, it was an Anglican chapel. The Bishop of Manchester had this tradition of always appointing the Methodist chaplain at the university to that particular role of chaplain at that hall of residence. So Wednesday evening, I used to go in and take an Anglican service of Holy Communion. It was alternative service book at that time, on a Wednesday evening. And one of the things that was a bit challenging is a senior resident at that hall of residence was Barnabas Lindars, who had been was the professor of biblical criticism and exegesis at University of Manchester, and I actually studied under him. But I then had him in my congregation, which was a bit nerve-wracking, I can tell you. But there we are. But he was very, very gracious and humble, and he was very, very clear that even though he was an Anglican priest, I was the chaplain and he would act as my deacon for the service. It was a very exciting time. Students, bright young things with all of life ahead of them. But we also lived in Whalley Range, and if you know anything about Manchester, in those days it was a red light district. Okay. So when I used to come home on a Wednesday night or a Friday night, I could sort of count the number of working women that there were on the streets before I got home. And I also think, well, that's a sort of symbol of how divided society is, because some of those working women were the same sort of age as those students that I'd led in worship in a very sort of privileged situation just a few minutes ago. And yet the life chances for these women on the streets, is just so totally different. As well as being the Methodist chaplain at university, I was also had pastoral charge of Wesley Methodist Church in Hume. Those of you who remember when Hilary spoke, she used to be the lay worker there. So she got there before me, But that was it's a modern church built in this Hume estate. Then was these huge, great big concrete crescents, and a bit pretty godforsaken, really. And there was a saying in the community that the estate is so rough that even the Alsatian dogs go round in pairs for their own protection. You become aware of the differences that there are in society and the differences between people's life chances that were there. And that changed me a lot about what I wanted to do. When it came to leave, well, do you want to go and do another chaplaincy somewhere else? And I said, well, no. I felt I've not had the time to do the inner city ministry, that I've found a real challenge. I want to do something in that sort of area. So it was time to move on. And I ended up going to Leeds to work in Chapeltown in Leeds, which is a mixed and multicultural situation with a black majority congregation, and most of the people in that church came from St Kitts and Nevis, and that is their national flag. There we are. That again changed me enormously, because in the pastoral work that I was doing, I became aware of what it's like to live on the wrong side of racism in this country. Which side are you on? There are all sorts of stories that people told me about how they were treated when they first came to this country. You may be aware that the British government in the 1950s had a huge advertising campaign to ask people from the Caribbean to come over to this country, the Windrush generation, because we needed people to, run the buses and do the health service and collect the rubbish and so on. There was a big invitation for people to come across. But when they got here, they found that they were not welcomed. Now, one of the stories that I've listened to that was told in a public arena was about the origin of what used to be called blues clubs. People go, if they're working hard, they like to go to the pub at the weekend for a drink with their friends, just to unwind, get themselves ready for the next week. This guy was saying, well, there was a pub that I used to go to with my friends. I have my pint of beer. When I finished, I put it back on the bar, and the barman had a dustbin behind the bar, and he would quite deliberately take the glass, walk over to the dustbin and throw it in and smash it, and said, well, after a black person's drunk from that glass, no white man will have to do it again. It's a pub, a public house. You can't stop someone from coming in, but there are all sorts of ways you can make it clear that they're not welcome. Well, that was common experience. So how do you get round that when you want to meet with your friends and have a drink, on Sunday night before you go back to work on Monday morning and you get all of that stuff all over again? Well, I know what. Look, you all come round to my house. I'll get some whiskey and some beer in, and we can all have a drink together. You just pay me what the cost will be for your drink, and we can have an easy time together and enjoy ourselves. It's a very, very sensible solution. But it is the resale of alcohol without a license, and so it's illegal, and so the police come in and close you down. But there was no legislation for the police at that time to go into the pub and say, how you treated this black person is not acceptable. One of the things that I always used to sort of laugh about with some of the older generation is that there was always this sense of precariousness of life, and you didn't know whether you were going to be alive the next day, the vulnerability of life. Whenever you're trying to set a meeting date, okay, well, we'll meet next Sunday. Well, if the Lord spare my life, if the Lord spare my life, I'll be there. I can't guarantee. People live with that sense of, well, we're in God's hands. And, we can't assume the longevity that we often, as white people, take. But the church was about trying to affirm people's dignity. How do you sing the Lord's song in a strange land when people work in a very, very different cultural way to the way that you are used to? One of the books that's been written about African Americans is just called in religion. It's just called Come Sunday. The joy of coming to church on Sunday to gather with a black majority congregation where you're not going to be faced with racism. It's just such a good experience. How do we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? The church I was minister of was called Roscoe Methodist Church, and there was a real commitment to the needs of the people in that community. So after the Sunday morning service, the Sunday evening service was finished, rather than in this church, you turn it around and make a cafe, don't you? They ran what became a Citizens Advice Bureau, because they were wanting to give people advice. Well, is it right? Is it fair? When you get thrown out of your lodgings for no reason at all, how do you respond when it says no Irish, no dogs, no black people? So they built up this reputation of giving good citizens advice, and it went from strength to strength, and there was an opportunity to finance, so they built a set of offices and a sports hall adjacent to the church, and there was this CAB that had about 15, 16 staff in it, giving advice to people as to how to manage things when they felt that they were being treated unfairly or unjustly. There was also a nursery that ran there, and again, it was people from very different cultural backgrounds, the little children learning how to play together and be together. And there was a boys' brigade there as well, giving some leadership skills and Christian nourishment to a lot of these young men. But one of the things that really, really struck me, and I learnt in this community, was how they manage death. Because there's a whole funeral ritual that I hadn't experienced much before that I was into. So the funeral services were quite long. There was always, or almost always, an open coffin. So we're quite straightforward. This person has died. We're not pretending that it hasn't happened. People would speak about the deceased. I have to be careful about how I say that. They wouldn't break down in the middle of it, but their flow of conversation would be disrupted as the grief came out. And it was quite acceptable that grief came out in these services. There was a viewing of the body. Anybody who wanted to could pass by the open coffin to pay their final respects. And you had the final hymn. And then there was a coach that was laid on, and we would go up to the cemetery, and there would be a grave that would be open and dug, and the coffin would go in, and then, quite literally, the men would fill the grave, and the women would stand round and sing. And then there was another set of prayers when the grave was actually closed. But it didn't finish there, because then everyone went to the West Indian Centre or another of these centres, and there was plenty to eat and there was plenty to drink. It was a whole day thing, and emotion flowed. And it's fascinating listening to people in that congregation talk about these white people. They don't really understand about death. It's a cultural thing. They're stiff upper lip and there's no emotion at all. There must be something wrong with them, really. Well, I learnt about how to manage grief and how to take that seriously and how to mourn properly. It was a multicultural situation as well. So, when I went to walk down from the Manchester Church, I went past the local, the Polish Roman Catholic Church, the local Anglican Church, the Church of God of Prophecy, the Sikh temple, and then I came to the Methodist Church. And if you go to the other end of the road, there's the mosque there as well. So it's multiple situations. Timekeeping was always a sort of good issue, and I learned to be a lot more relaxed about time than I am. And, as a white person, you put this watch on when you get up, don't you? And you keep it with you, and you take it off when you go to bed, and you put it on your bedside, so it's not very far away, and then you put it on, next morning, Okay. Well, there used to be this thing called Chapeltown Time. Church of God of Prophecy was a good one on this one, because they had their services that ran from 12 noon to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And you got there when you could, and you left when you had to. It's fluid, very fluid, Preacher isn't in, and it's 10:31, what's... Okay. It's very different. But yeah, it was multicultural as well. And so some schools were in a wonderful situation where they could, you could do religion by just going to the local different religious centres in the community. So, sometimes school groups were brought into church, and, the brief was, can you explain Christian faith and worship in 10 to 15 minutes and then take any questions that, that's always quite good. You never quite knew what questions you were going to get. I can remember one time I felt myself in a bit of a tight corner because one person asked, in Christian weddings, why is it that the woman always wears a white dress? What's its significance? Well, you try explaining that to an 8-year-old in front of, the whole class. It doesn't quite mean what it used to mean a couple of generations ago. But there's one boy who put up his hand, okay, well, what's your question? And he said, why do you have all of these chairs here? Oh, for goodness sake, that's the stupid people sit on them, don't they? But I thought, no, it mustn't be like that. There's no such thing as a stupid question. This boy's asked this question, just give him a straight answer. Well, we sit on them. When people come into church, there's a chair there for them to sit on. We stand up when it's for him, and we sit down for the rest of the service, so people are comfortable. Okay? And I looked at him, and he looked at me with this very puzzled expression on his face. I know what this is about. At the mosque that he goes to, the worship area is just carpeted. And the men come in and they sit on the floor and they kneel on the floor to pray. The times when I've been into mosque, you see there might be 2 or maybe 3 chairs on the back wall for people who are just so elderly and infirm that they can't kneel on the floor any longer. And you could see this boy, you must have an awful lot of very elderly people in there if you need this number of chairs. Across the face of the earth, there is so much difference in humanity. There are so many different human ways of responding to the divine, aren't there? And your normal is not my normal, and my normal is not your normal. And how we learn to understand each other is of crucial importance. So it was a very, very rich experience. Oh goodness me, I've gone on for far too long, haven't I? But I shall very quickly try and finish. Yes, so after that we moved to East Leeds, which was very sort of very monochrome culture. And I haven't actually got a symbol for that, and I found it really interesting that I didn't have a symbol for it, but I've got something else, which is about where I am now. Which is, I'm happily retired. Okay, so I'll leave that there. You may well be aware that ministers these days, and particularly superintendents, have to deal with a whole lot of new challenges in relation to safeguarding, and sometimes there are issues to do with capability and competence that come up, or complaint and discipline, and managing lay workers, and what do you do when things go wrong. So there was an awful lot of that on my plate in that time. Also becoming a mixed economy of ordained and lay staff, and sometimes some ministers found it quite difficult to end up working with lay people, so some of that was quite hard to manage. So it was actually a really hard time. Also during that period, our chair of district needed some surgery very, very quickly, and I was asked to act up as chair of district for a period, so that was an extra pressure as well. So in many ways I was glad it came to an end, also recognising it was church, that we were going through COVID right at the end, and it was a church in decline, and that's really difficult. So I've actually needed quite a bit of time to recover from that experience, and I'm very happy to be retired. And it's opportunity for me to have more time for family, for enjoying sitting in the congregation on one of your chairs, walking, learning to play the clarinet, enjoying some music and theatre, reconnecting with friends, making new friends, engaging with some work with the Labour Party. I've got a freedom that I didn't have before, so I'm very happily retired. So, last of all, a last piece of music. Well, even though I'm retired as an active minister, there is still the sense that we journey on, we seek God's kingdom. One piece of music I did think of having is something out of Brahms's German Requiem, Denn wir haben hier keine bleibende Stadt, for we have here no abiding city. It's from Hebrews 13. There's that journey that we are all on. However, we've ended up, because of a change in our financial situation, not having being housed by the Methodist Church's housing society, but actually buying our own property. And for the first time in my life, I actually live in a house that belongs to us. When someone knew that I was retiring, a friend of mine knew it, and he knew that, well, Methodist, you call it sitting down, don't you? You know, she sent me this little piece of music, which is by R.L. Burnside, Wish I Was in Heaven Sitting Down. Well, for me, perhaps that's where I am. Heaven can be a place on earth, can't it? And I am enjoying my situation here, and I am enjoying sitting down, and if the Lord spares my life, I will be here to the end of my days. So, when I was in heaven, sitting down, it's a bit repetitive, so I'm sure they'll just skip a bit of it, but...
Well, I wish I was in heaven sitting down. Wish I was in heaven sitting down. Lord, angels, oh my Lord. Wish I was in heaven sitting down. Take away my sin and give me grace. Take away my sin and give me grace. Oh, Lord, angels, oh, my Lord, wish I was in heaven sitting down. Wish I was in heaven sitting down. Well, I wish I was in heaven sitting down. Wish I was in heaven sitting down. Lord, angels, oh my Lord, wish I was in heaven sitting down. Take away my sin and give me grace. Take away my
Well, Hilary, it seems you've been very successful, because in your time you've been here, you've obviously created a situation that at least for Robert, being at the triangle is a bit like in heaven, sitting down. So that's wonderful. And thank you very much. Memory and memories are very important, aren't they? And it's, you know, people, you know, it's gone on and on, and heard it all before, but when you hear it for the first time about somebody you've got to know and like very quickly, it's interesting to know about and to understand their journey and their spiritual journey also, which is really why we're here and talking about it in any case. So memories are great. Even bad memories have a part to play sometimes in our lives. And it's all about life chances, and we do appreciate what you've said to us this evening, Robert, so thank you for that. And I think I was most moved by what he said about the problems of racism at the time, and sad to say it, so it goes on. But the way it was overcome and dealt with in that particular situation was very encouraging. And it's right to be reminded that we still have to fight that particular battle. So, thank you very much, Robert. That's been really, really good. We've enjoyed every moment. Would you like to show your appreciation? Our next meeting will be on the 17th of May, and when Steve Mazavek, one of our members, will be bringing his 5 objects and 2 songs for us to enjoy, to think about, to reminisce, or he will reminisce and we will think on what he has to say to us. But once again, it's been really good. We say this every time we have a FFF. It's so different than the last one, and yet so special in its own way, and well, it gets better in a sense. It's good that that's the case, is what I'm trying to say. So thank you very much. Shall we just say a word of prayer? Lord, we thank you for memory. We thank you for opportunity. We thank you for things that teach us what we need to know, what we ought to know, and what we should know. It can be difficult for some people sometimes, Lord, and we pray that you will bless those under stress and those in difficulties. We pray that you will make us all aware of what we have to do and how we have to do it. We just also remember, Lord, that how we do it is not necessarily right in everyone's eyes. How we do it is different from how someone else does it, but if they are praising you and growing in grace and moving closer to you, that's what it's all about. So we pray that in so many ways and in all these ways, your kingdom may come here on earth. Thank you, Lord, for listening. Amen. Amen. And I wish you all a safe journey home and a good night's sleep. Thank you.